Good morning, everyone, and welcome to you all on this somewhat chilly morning in Johannesburg. Winter definitely on the way, and let us hope that this will not be a winter of our discontent. I'm here this morning, Terence Corrigan, Projects and Publications Manager at the Institute of Race Relations, joined by my colleague and friend Sara, formerly of the IRR, very, very formally, just a couple of days, and now full-time Director of the Free Speech Union, South Africa. And we are here to launch a paper that we jointly composed on South Africa's public service, titled "In Service of the Public: Reforming South Africa's Public Administration." Now, I'm sure that many people watching, and those who will be watching later online, and those who will hopefully be reading this document in due course, are all familiar with one of the great disappointments of the South African condition. That is dealing with the South African public service. There was a joke that was made, I think, back in the 60s, that in South Africa the civil service is neither civil nor serving, and sadly, it hasn't got much better. In fact, so much so that the lack of what is called a capable state is viewed as one of the major strategic challenges confronting the country, something that President Ramaphosa has highlighted as a priority for his administration. With it must be said, in a mixed bag of results. I think that's putting it kindly. Before I kick off, I would just like to also extend a word of thanks to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, our partner in this endeavor, without whose generous support this project would never have been able to get off the ground. This paper is part of a series, our Blueprints for Growth, which are intended to highlight key issues that need to be addressed in South Africa if we are to elevate our growth trajectory into something like the 5, 6, 7% that South Africa needs to sustain over a protracted period, to start clearing the legions of unemployed, to start elevating the country's poor, whether unemployed or the working poor, into a kind of aspirant middle class status, and basically to making South Africa the high performing emerging market that it should be and it can be. So today we're talking about how you and I are governed in service of the public, reforming South Africa's public administration. Let's proceed. If we can, the presentation that we're going to give jointly is divided into two sections. First of all, I'll be running through through the nature of the problem. What are we talking about? What has brought us to this point? And then Sara will be taking over and will be highlighting a list of to-dos, things that we need to do to get the public service back on track. Specifically, I'll be talking about what the public service is. I'll also be talking about a theme that we are addressing in our blueprints this year, which is the question of social cohesion. Much has been said about how this remains the unfinished business of the transition. We created South Africa, now we need to create South Africans, if I might borrow something from Italian history. And what does a well-functioning public service mean for that? How did we get here? And a diagnosis of what the problem is. Then we'll be talking about what needs to be done: depoliticization, the role of the unions, management, organizational discipline, recruitment, capacitation, and technology. And then we'll be rounding it out by looking forward. So, to move on, the public service. What also much in the news for the past nearly a year now is the strange animal, the GNU or the GNU. I'm not quite sure how one pronounces that, but satirized as a sort of antelope type creature, mostly by Zapiro. The Government of National Unity. This, I think, had the potential to be a major game changer in South Africa. The dominance of the ANC, I think, has been cracked, and I don't see that coming back. More remarkably, though, was the sight of the Democratic Alliance and the ANC sharing the government podium. Now, I'm sure it needs no further comment that this is a very, very difficult relationship. But one thing that they seem to be able to agree on is the need for a better quality of public administration. So in their opening statement, their statement of principles, they pledged a professional, merit-based, non-partisan developmental public service that puts people first, and then building a state capacity and creating a professional, merit-based, corruption-free and developmental public service, restructuring and improving state-owned entities to meet national development goals. Now, that's typically South African word salad, but there's a few words I'd like to draw your attention to. First of all, merit. People being appointed because they are deserving of being there, that they actually add value. Professional, being located in this institution because you subscribe to a particular ethos and you are loyal to the institution as an institution. Non-partisan, to function without overt regard for any other interest, whether that's a political party, whether that's a criminal syndicate, both of which unfortunately have got their claws into the operations of the state. And developmental. I think this is very important. South Africa's constitution was written with the idea of a developmental mandate, the idea that the state was not simply going to be a night watchman that watch traffic go hither and thither, but was going to be something that would actually drive the well-being of South Africa's people. Well, one can always say that that intentions are easier than actuality, but I think very few people, not even those who have occupied the governmental office for 30 years now, would claim that this is fundamentally what our public service is doing. Moving along. How many people are employed in the public service? Well, Stats SA uses the metric of the government sector, which includes things like like parastatals, state-owned entities, local government, national and provincial government, and comes up with a figure of about 2.1 million. That is a lot of people. Now the core of that is about 1.3 to 1.5, depending on who you include in that, and a wage bill at about 12% of GDP. By global standards, that's high. Typically, the percentage of GDP spent on the public sector wages is around 9%. So we're about 3 percentage points over that. And this is a major strategic challenge for us, because what we have seen over time is a redirection of state spending from investment, from building the roads and the hospitals, into paying the salaries. Now, this is not for a moment to say that the conduct of or that the pay packets of civil servants should not reflect value, but that if ever more is being pulled into paying for those human resources, and particularly in a low growth environment, there is commensurately less to spend on giving them the tools to do the job and to enable the economic activity, which ultimately collects the revenue to do that job. Plus, there has been a lot spoken about lately, in view of the difficulty that the GNU has had in assembling a workable budget, on the idea that South Africa has now hit a fiscal cliff. Effectively, we've borrowed ourselves into a problem. We are not. There just isn't a great deal more to spend. So something has to give. Let's go to the next one. So what does this mean for social cohesion? Well, the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development describes social cohesion or a cohesive society as one that works towards the well-being of all its members, fights exclusion and marginalization, creates a sense of belonging, promotes trust, and offers its members the opportunity of upward mobility. Now, this speaks very much, I think, to the idea of a developmental public service. One needn't be sold on the idea of a mighty East Asian-style developmental state that intrudes in every facet of life to realize that competent public administration makes life better. It is competent public administration that ensures that the water and power remains on. That when you apply for your passport, you are not cast into a sort of official limbo for 6 or 7 years. I have had personal experience of being stuck in such situations. It's something that means that when you do need to interact with Home Affairs or with the local municipality, you are treated with respect, rather than as a burden and an encumbrance and somebody who needs to supplicate. And what it also means is that where things function efficiently, where the state functions efficiently, the economy is more likely to function efficiently, and this has knock-on effects. A functioning state helps to create the conditions for a healthy, functioning, and in South Africa's case, I would say much less angry society. So, getting our state right is not just about issuing passports or keeping the power on. It's not even just about whether the conditions exist to grow the economy. It's about whether we will feel better, more at ease with one another, and whether it will help to create those South Africans that I spoke about earlier. Moving along. Where do we stand at the moment? Well, polling evidence shows there's declining trust in institutions and confidence in the future of the country. This is quite remarkable. If you go back to Afrobarometer's polling in 1994, you will see something like 3/4 of South Africans believe that South Africa was on the right track, that the future was bright. If you look at their polling today, those numbers have turned upside down. Only about 20% of South Africans are confident in the future. If you look at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, there's not a single institution that they inquire about which commands a majority of public trust. Even and this goes beyond the state. There's even minority trust now in people's immediate or relatives, which always used to be a kind of exception. People would trust their relatives. Well, now we have always been a fairly low trust society. Well, now it is catastrophic. So the societal stresses, one can imagine, are aggravated by economic stagnation. When we see crowds turning upon the foreign-owned spaza shop, what you're witnessing there are people who feel that there is such a tiny pool of opportunity that anybody actually enjoying an opportunity has somehow taken it. And many people put these two together and look down the road and say, well, what future will my child have? And I think central to all this is the failure of governance. The sense that South Africa is in many ways simply an ungoverned space. I imagine all of us, almost all of us, have had some experience where we've been subjected to some minor crime, or maybe not so minor, but we don't bother to report it because it's too much of a hassle, and what will come of it anyway. In fact, I once went to a police station and I was asked, "Do you actually want this? Do you just want this for insurance, or do you want it investigated?" Unfortunately, that's kind of where we are. Moving along. So the big question, and this is very important to understanding where we're going. How did we get here? Well, let's have a look at this. You can get the next slide. Our report looks at 3 phases. Phase 1, symbolized, I think, mostly by Thabo Mbeki, or this was also the Mandela era. We're talking about 1994 to around 2007, 2008. What you had was a two-tier process. One, the transition happened. It was necessary to think of South Africa's administration in a new way. You needed to build institutions. Remember, things like many of our Chapter 9 institutions didn't exist. We moved from an order based on parliamentary sovereignty into a constitutional democracy. And for the most part, I think this was achieved fairly competently, although with major problems, particularly at local government level, which is one that I'll be returning to from time to time. This is an area that South Africa has never properly been able to get right. And remember, local government is the area that interacts with people most directly. There was the transition, there was the institution building, but and this was something that South Africa had in common with many post-colonial states. It was not simply a change from one regime to another, but a change from one, let's say, dominant political force to another. South Africa had the National Party since 1948, and now it had the ANC. The ANC, remember, came in with about, I think, 61, 62%. I'm not sure the exact numbers offhand in 1994. But it was the big game in town, outside the Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And by 1996, 97, it was talking about this program for hegemony and transformation. Now, transformation, I think, has to be properly understood. Demographic transformation was part of it, and this has often been the way that it's been presented in a sort of forward-facing way. But the ANC made it very clear. Transformation meant fundamentally putting party control over these institutions. And out of that came cadre deployment, combined with a sometimes, I think, reckless disregard for the imperatives of experience and skills. We had a fairly aggressive form of demographic transformation. And at one stage, an ANC member of parliament who went on to become a member of the Public Service Commission said explicitly, it is imperative to get rid of merit as the overriding principle in appointments. Well, I suppose one can say that was pretty much what was done. What we ended up with was were institutions that were increasingly being hollowed out. I would say that South Africa was fortunate in its initial years that there were a good many high quality committed people who were brought in. There was still administrative skills and experience from the previous dispensation that continued. But as the hegemonic project pushed on, those became less and less of a buffer. So phase two, we can fairly neatly track to the Jacob Zuma presidency. And essentially what you had here was, state capture is the typical formulation, but I think we need to understand this properly. It wasn't the character or the person of Jacob Zuma that drove this. He was able to ride a wave that had been established. The idea that somehow the ANC as a party had the right to fill positions that were constitutionally non-partisan was by now simply part of the furniture. And if in the mid-90s these people had been, as I say, educated people of standing and gravitas, well, the process wasn't much different by the time Zuma took over, but certainly the caliber of person. Was. And there was a great deal more, I think, overt, rapacious spending and suborning of institutions for personal gain. Under Mbeki, this had usually been hidden with a kind of patina of ideology, and it still was to some extent under President Zuma. But I think increasingly the veneer was falling off. Interestingly, though, at this time, you did have a few reviews, and the NDP in 2012, 2013, and then 2014 again. And there were not so much warning flags as red lights going off about the state of the public service. And some of these were quite adamant that what was happening was the abandonment of a commitment to merit, ignoring the skills deficit, the lack of skills, pushing forward with inappropriate political appointments. The phraseology that was often used is the administrative political interface, which is a nice way of saying that the politicians were grabbing the administration. Anyway, interface 3, and this is what I think we can associate with President Ramaphosa and now with the GNU. There has been a great deal of talk about the capable state, about a state that is able to perform its functions. They can play that developmental mandate, which manifestly couldn't by the end of the Zuma presidency. And there's been reviews of the public service. There's been a framework for the professionalization. I always find that interesting. We're not talking about the re-professionalization. We are talking about the professionalizations that 30 years on after the transition. Oops, this is something that that might be a good idea. Well, better late than never, I suppose. But that, I think, illustrates the scale of the problem. But the word I would use to describe what has actually happened is stasis. I think that there is too much that has simply remained untouchable, and too little that has actually been done that needs to be done. If we can move on. So a diagnosis. The public service has this extensive developmental mandate. Next. But there has been a massive failure of professionalization. People are in positions where that they are simply not capable of performing their functions, and they are not functioning within the organization, within the designed strictures of the organization. I've been I was told by someone involved with local government that what has happened, what started out as politicization, effectively turned into organized crime. He said that people who were put into positions because it was felt that they would exercise a sort of influence on behalf of their political party, went up through the ranks, started to see opportunities for enrichment, saw the breakdown of discipline in their own parties, and realized that effectively there was no party mandate; they had to choose sides, and soon it became an entirely mercenary game. So, he said it is not only a matter of people putting their party ahead of their professional responsibilities. It is the fact that the party has now lost out to the criminal syndicate, and this has become a crippling problem. I don't think that I would need to say more than to mention the name of Babita Deokara, a civil servant who actually tried to blow the whistle on malfeasance and was gunned down in a hit, which it seems that, aside maybe from some low rankers, I'm not sure that anybody really expects the sort of justice for Babita that one sees, and that is a travesty in a law-governed society, and it's also a tragedy for the institution that somebody trying to do the right thing had to pay for it with their life. Let's move on. So, how do we get back on track? And at this point, I'm going to turn over to Sara.
Sorry, they pressed the wrong button. Terence, just to say, to start off with it, IRR is a bit like a Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never really leave. So here I am, and we're going to look at the first and the most fundamental thing that needs to happen in the public service, and building on what Terence has said. You've got to depoliticize it. And cadre deployment has been the enemy in this respect, because it is the deployment of cadres for whatever purpose the ANC may have had and the government may have had. When you put in place people who you either owe favors to or you wish to favor in some way, you're very likely not going to have the skills required for the job. And the entity that really pointed that out graphically was the Zondo Commission, where it said cadre deployment is not allowed, and it pointed out that appointments have to be merit-based, skills-based, and non-partisan, etc. So, abolishing cadre deployment and reforming the civil service to put the Public Service Commission, which was intended originally to effectively control and manage how the public service operated, that the PSC has to become the controller of the process once again. Now, of course, this would require the ANC to change its ideological approach. And unfortunately, despite the GNU and despite much of what the ANC has said over the years, there's not a lot of sense that the ideology is going anywhere. But things can be done. Next slide. Now, one of the big issues now is the role of the unions. Now, unionism has a fascinating, conflicted, but impressive history in this country, and particularly in the years just before, in the decade just before the transition to democracy, laws changed, black employees could be unionized, black unions would be recognized. But because of the alliance between the ANC, the SACP, and COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the COSATU unions gained a distinctly unfair advantage over other unions from other sectors and from other federations. And this meant that COSATU unions, in the end, retained control largely over the public sector, but eventually the competition in the private sector saw the impact of COSATU diminish. So it has retained that grip over the public sector. At the same time, what has naturally happened for a whole lot of reasons to do with the economy, skills development or not, etc., unionism has declined, and this has happened worldwide. It is only seeing a bit of an increase now in the West. It is not a South African phenomenon only, and there is a perception as a result of this favoritism that union members, public servants, have been overpaid, have become entitled, have become possibly a bit arrogant, but the reality is that unions essentially do not exist unless people are members of are employed by an entity, whether it's a public or private entity. And the better, in fact, the circumstances are for unionization, the more they have a vested interest in that. They essentially have an interest in promoting professionalism, to promote their own interest, to have an effective say by having a greater number of members. And there is, to refer to Terence's points, there is a stasis in this regard. Unions in the public sector tend to be stuck, and they behave in a way that does not meet a modern economy, whether it be a private sector entity or a public sector entity. The other thing is that employers are essentially responsible for employees. Unions only have a role once a company or a public sector has employees. And that's only at the only point at which unions can motivate for membership and sign up employees as union members. Union members and unions do not play a subordinating role of the company or the entity. They are there to serve their members, but their ability to serve the members depends on the existence of the overriding entity. And so the privileged political relationship with COSATU, between COSATU and the ANC, needs to change, and preferably competition needs to be much easier to exercise between various union movements of different stripes. This competition, while it can be fraught, it is also in the interests of the employees to be able to have that choice to the extent that they feel it is necessary to have their conditions improved and their positions saved or secured. Next slide, please. Good leadership and management. I think I can safely say that this is probably one of the biggest challenges for the public sector, because you might have management which is not good and is not managing, and you certainly have very little leadership, because leadership is exercised by being prepared to manage the environment and not to reach consensus, which is very much an ethos that our president enjoys. Leaders have to lead an enterprise to success, and that applies as much for the public sector as it does for the private sector. At the same time, leadership is about making decisions that are difficult to make and taking responsibility, which is all the more difficult. And it is both making the right decisions and the failure to take responsibility that is probably one of the biggest problems in the public sector. At the same time, employees have to be managed firmly but fairly, and at the same time, in so doing, the employer is entitled to have high expectations of performance. That performance has to be properly monitored, and good performance has to be maintained. So in other words, what a management has to do is constantly manage the consequences of what the employees do and how they do it, and whether they meet the needs of us, the public. And a crucial thing that took a long time for many in the private sector to understand, that is crucial in the public sector. Senior management must support lower level management, because senior management can't control every employee and can't manage every employee. That is in the hands of succeeding levels of management. That management must be capable of doing the job. They must do the job correctly. Senior management must be aware of that and monitor it, but they've also got to support their management and not interfere unduly. Those managers must have the respect and support of their own workforces. Next slide. Now, sorry, I'll say whatever you want me to say, so may the chips lie where they're for. As Terence knows, my favorite subject about employment is discipline, organizational discipline, which is not just about correcting bad behavior or poor performance, but it's also about creating structure and it must create a sense that employees know exactly what is expected of them and what support they will get. But they must also know that in the event that they don't perform, or in the event they commit criminal acts or other forms of misconduct, discipline will be taken. And in order to discipline properly, managers actually have to fully be aware of and understand their own policies and the contractual obligations it has with their employees. It also means that management should make employees aware and have access to copies of conditions of employment, disciplinary procedures, grievance procedures, and policies that relate thereto. Now, human resources departments, which often get spoke about and not necessarily with the best will in the world, are responsible for keeping accurate records and assisting line management to carry out their disciplinary responsibilities and their management of people. They are not, however, responsible for that function that is in the realm of management, of line management entirely. And in order to achieve that, senior management and human resources must be expected to train lower levels of management in what is expected of them and how to take responsibility and make those rough, tough decisions. Next. Now, recruitment, of course, means that you need the right people in the right job. So you need the right skills for the appropriate skill levels. You need merit to be the supreme basis for putting someone in a position. And I think the problem we're suffering from with essentially a largely dysfunctional public sector is that if people don't know what they're doing, decisions won't be made and anything can happen, or more pertinently, nothing can happen. And we've all experienced that. We've all been on the other side of that. And the consequence is when we encounter a public servant who does their job well and pleasantly and respectfully, it is a truly uplifting experience. But in order to make sure that you have the right people at all levels, you must make sure that your recruitment processes contain these fundamental principles and are based on these fundamental principles. And as we say, visible meritocracy must be a requirement. In certain positions, and particularly at the higher levels, exams may be considered necessary for applicants for positions in order to enter into or progress through the public service. And there are many areas, as we have seen in the areas of electricity and water, or the lack of electricity and water, how much technical skills are required, engineering, and other technical areas of expertise are needed to properly provide a professional public service. At the same time, its management is obliged to verify people's qualifications, or the qualifications that they allege they have. And we've had many public servants at high levels suspended or expelled, not expelled, sorry, I'm going back to the school metaphor, and dismissed for having dodgy or false qualifications. And thorough background checks must be instituted where potential applicants actually give references and give an indication of where and who they've worked for. It is incumbent upon management to make sure that they have checked those references and spoken to former employees. And it's an area most employers, private and public, fail to do properly. And there are always nasty surprise consequences coming from that. But by garnering all this information, it also assists to ascertain what aptitudes the employees have that are good for the civil service, and possibly even for another or better position than that applied for, which could make also progression through the public service a really attractive option for an applicant for employment. And as Terence has already said, there is no reason that decent salaries shouldn't be paid for being in the public sector, that respect and status should go to certain positions in the public sector, but they must be earned and they must be capable of being made the best of. Next, please. Now, notwithstanding bringing skills into the enterprise, the public sector needs to capacitate its employees at all levels as best as possible. And in that respect, it must prioritize building a suitable skills base, but a skills base that is needed. What you have now currently is a disproportionate amount of management in much of the public sector and a relatively small amount of employees who are there to actually do the fundamental work. And that's a complete inversion of what a proper civil service, competence civil service is meant to provide. So skills development and application, as well as exposure to effective practice and formal instruction. And one of the biggest problems that we're now left with the civil service is having denuded the service of skills. Those skills were originally in the hands of whites, but it doesn't take away from the fact that they had the skills. And what the civil service, what the government needed to create was an environment in which those skills properly trained the generations that have come after that. And training is not just about technical and practical training. It's about being exposed to a wealth of experience and knowledge that is required over time to do a job well. And to have people who can effectively mentor their staff is invaluable. And to a large extent, much of that was lost. Professional development programs can also be used as a metric to get a sense of where your employees are at, what they need, what they offer, where they can go, and are they performing the job required of them. And that can only be an advantage to the development of the professionalism within the public sector. On the other hand, managers are not the fonts of all knowledge, and they should be welcome to staff approaching them with innovative ideas. Management must not seem to take the view that the big stuff, the important stuff, resides only with them. It also shows that they have confidence in their own abilities to being open to what subordinates can offer that they may not have thought of or considered. Next. Now, technology is only as good as the use to which it is put. Information technology, and digitization, and now artificial intelligence, can be hugely beneficial and will play increasingly a role in society as a whole. And technology just moves faster and faster. But the systems that are put in place have to work properly and have to be susceptible to being updated on a regular basis. The problem is that the current IT system, the state IT system, does not operate well, and it sort of travels all the way through the system. And you've all had experiences with breakdowns at, say, the Master's Office or the Department of Home Affairs or others. And sometimes those breakdowns and the inability to use technology to provide an efficient, fast, and effective service can lead to frustration, a lack of respect, a lack of trust, and sometimes it can even lead to consequences such as injury and death. And I won't elaborate on that, but the reliance on systems has to go with the systems being good enough to be relied upon. So you need a well-functioning state information technology agency. It's critical, and because it's so unreliable at the moment, the Minister of Home Affairs has even said he wants to opt out and develop his own technology. The problem is that technology has to serve different ministries across the spectrum in order for the ministries to best operate in relationship to each other, and they must become less atomized and siloed than they are at present. Next. Looking forward, Terence, how do we look forward? Where do we go from here?
Well, I see one of our viewers has said, thank you for taking on this important topic. In our failing state, we have great expectations, and I think that's something that we should all have. I think that it's important to understand that this is not a monocausal problem. And I think it's also important to understand this is not a problem of money. In fact, injecting too much money into a system can be as bad as injecting too little. South Africa's spending on its public service is adequate. In fact, in another one of our blueprint papers, we argue that South Africa is now kind of breaking new ground in the sense that state expenditure as a whole, of which this is probably the single biggest chunk, is now actually delivering a negative multiplier. In other words, it's sucking the life out of the surrounding economy, which virtually no society, even very badly running corrupt ones, do. The first thing is that we have to accept that we have to commit to proper reforms. As we've said, I think the most obvious one is the depoliticization and this can best be achieved by restoring the Public Service Commission to its role as the kind of institutional body responsible for the public service. So I think this bears restating. Politicization is not just a function of cadre deployment. The Public Service Act has made it possible for politicians to become involved in the employment of public servants. And it's been said that because of this piece of legislation, every civil service, public servant in South Africa is effectively a political appointment. So we need to move away from that. On the other hand, while the laws need to change, the approach of politicians has changed too. Now, I remember going back into the 1990s. Then President Mandela, this was kind of announcing the sort of beginnings of cadre deployment, that ANC members must realize they are not just ANC members after hours. And I think we have to turn that on its head and say, you're very welcome to support whatever party you want. Use your constitutional right. You will do that only after hours now. When you walk through these doors, you become a servant of the public. And I think this is an interesting thing. Another one of our viewers says that the RDP seems to have done more compared to the NDP. And I think what one must bear in mind is that back in that in those early days, there was simply, I think, much more capacity to be drawn on. As I say, there were technical skills that were inherited, which I think sadly, despite warnings in government documents, were not retained. And you can see this if you look at, for instance, the number of professional engineers. There's hard data on this, and this is we've sort of expanded the number of technicians, but not the sort of higher end skills. Those have, in some respects, completely disappeared. And this is what Sara was getting at, that you actually need the experience as well. This is no comment on people who are trying their best, but and maybe not getting it right. Well, because it takes time, it takes mentorship. So politicians need to understand that this is not a cash cow. This is not their toy to play with. This is, I might sound like some sort of EWC socialist here, but this is the common property of the people of South Africa. It does not belong to a political party, and any party taking over should have the right to have its lawful policies carried out, and to expect that people there are loyal to that institution. The government of the day, the political party of the day, it basically gets to do one thing, and that is to use that to advance its own program. So we need a major reality check on the part of the political class. So that from there we get to new internal dynamics, and operation methods have to be introduced. Now, another one of our viewers talks about the need for technology. Very, very important. But remember, technology has to be matched with the capacity of people to use it. And this is also why you need a good caliber of senior management that can actually assess: is this what we need? Do we need every bell and whistle here, or is it in the interests of a vendor to give you something way too complicated so that they can then get the maintenance contract and come in every other day? I must say, some recent experiences I've had at Home Affairs, I think, illustrate the best and the worst in this regard. On the one hand, 2 visits, nothing could be done because the system was down, but give the manager of Florida Home Affairs his due. He came out. He was very forthright, explained to us. When we actually eventually got in, he was walking around making sure that people knew where they were going. So 10 out of 10. But the thing is, you need the IT system to make sure that doesn't happen, and then you need the manager to make sure that people are using it properly.
Terence, Can I just
Yes,
add something?
please.
Add something there. We've our research has shown, and it's mentioned in the report, that sometimes the simplest things to do to get the necessary change is to, as I sort of alluded to, is respect staff. Don't come in and just get rid of staff, because it takes a while to know exactly what's happening. But the experience of the city of Cape Town when government changed showed that listening to staff and making them feel that they are being listened to allows for just an enormous amount of buy-in and preparedness to change. So, and the ideology of the political masters does not actually end up being that much of a hindrance to the change. You can get most people to go with you, and I think, just showing some respect and some care. It's a plain human response. If I can just digress a bit to answer Stuart Pennington's question, there's a lot of discussion about the reform of the municipalities, and they're crucial because those municipalities are that area of government that we interact with most, that most South Africans interact with for good or for ill. And the municipal system is pretty much disastrous. It's very much uppermost in people's minds. It is being talked about, but it is not. There's not, to my knowledge, any real programs for reform. And so essentially it's starting to happen, but we're not seeing anything yet coming out of it. And it's way, way late.
Look, on that issue, something that hit me like a bucket of cold water in the face was driving through Standerton. I used to do that route quite regularly when my parents were still alive, and I'd go down to KwaZulu-Natal. That was always the kind of halfway point between Johannesburg and northern KZN. And it always struck me as a sort of dull, provincial but functioning town. It's where you could stop and get a hamburger and fill up the car and whatever. Last time I drove through it, I am not exaggerating when I can tell you that the provincial road leading into the town was in better condition than the road in the town. It was an absolute eyesore. But yeah, look, one of the problems that's hit municipal government is that is often politicization on steroids, because positions in municipal offices may be the best paying ones available, and they can become extremely extractive. People for whom there is simply no real other career option, who may not be able to be elected as a councillor, can often be pulled in through a sort of local patronage network. And despite being the sort of, let's say, the lowest tier of government, it's in many ways the most difficult one to operate, because this is actually where the pipes are, and you need engineers and electricians and people like that. And although I am very sympathetic to the idea of contracting and privatizing, we've also seen that being being manipulated. See, our changes happened very much at the same time. There was something called a new public management coming in, which was about treating people, or treating your citizens as consumers, and outsourcing a lot of things, which I think is not an intrinsically bad idea. And I think in some respects it's probably the only way you can go if you can manage it properly. And unfortunately, then what you would have is kind of a patronage network taking over the administration, and then these sort of dummy companies being set up which could tender for the work and maybe not perform it at all, or maybe then subcontract it out. And as my late brother used to say, it became a dog and pony show. Yeah.
Well, so I'm going to take a point made about voting, how you vote and who you vote for. And I just want to make the point, and I'll use an overseas example just because it's very recent and very graphic. The Reform Party in the UK took a safe Labour seat in in last week's by-elections by 6 votes. 6 votes. And I think I think over 20,000 people voted, or just, I think in fact, Reform got 20,000 something, and Labour got 20,000 minus the 6. It can be that important that everyone does exercise their vote, and the exercise of your vote will obviously have an impact on what your civil service is going to look like. And it may explain also, because you've also got this awful tension within municipalities, and particularly at municipal level, where if people who are employed by or who are councillors to municipalities do not get voted in and do not maintain their employment, they probably are very likely not to be employed again. So the stakes are terribly, terribly high.
Right. On that, another of our viewers says, so the oath of office doesn't mean a thing to our politicians. I think, unfortunately, that that is a problem. That the ethical compass is not great. I would just say that you can find examples of let's say flexible ethics in any jurisdiction, and in any institution. The problem is the way that the sort of incentive structure is being created. Look, I would also like to give a dishonorable shout out to much of the commentariat, because I remember when cadre deployment was being loudly announced, that newspapers and analysts, I don't mean sort of insane guys with crazy hair and hammers and sickles on their t-shirts, but sober and judicious, would say, well, this means South Africa is moving from a British-style civil service to an American-style civil service. No, we were moving into a highly politicized dysfunctionality, and we should have known that, because the cadre deployment was illegal from day one. I do think that it's very interesting that all those minutes from the state capture period, when the chairman of the committee was none other than our current president, just don't seem to be available. Strange that, but
Perhaps I can just say before you wrap up, Terence, that Stuart asked whether the ANC is listening to the IRR. I think they're listening, but, no, they're hearing, but they're not listening. But a lot of other people, and probably much, much more of the voting class, the analyst class, and the class that has some impact, and in that I'm looking at business, is listening, because you've seen the debate about BE, should we have it or should we have it, is it good, is it not good, that is suddenly coming into the broad discussion base. And I have to say, I think the IRR is responsible for getting it out there. So in other words, the ANC may or may not be hearing it, but they can't avoid it anymore. So that's what we're here for.
Yeah, look, and there's sort of three more comments I just want to touch on, and then I think we can draw to a close. One relates directly to that. Remember, local government elections coming up, and there's been some very interesting polling that's shown that many ANC supporters have, almost with tears in their eyes, either abstained or voted against their party because of the association of the ANC with misgovernance. And these are people whose blood runs black, green, and gold, and whatever. But it's just come to a point where you say, enough. And I think that this could be, I think that for the ANC to remain anything like a going proposition, I don't think it'll be a 60% party again, but maybe for it to remain a 20% party, it's going to have to think very, very seriously about actual performance. Another of our viewers says that experience back in South Africa, extremely friendly and helpful, but totally incompetent. That, unfortunately, I think speaks to something else, that good intentions are not necessarily enough. I've also encountered people in both the public and private sectors who are absolutely well-meaning and have no clue what they're doing. My heart goes out, and I think that somebody like that is probably, deep down, is probably potentially a very, very good civil servant. But if you don't know where the files are kept and you've been shown that, you must have this document and nothing else, and whenever there's, the first problem, it's, there's a sort of panic. And finally, the government needs to recognize it does not hold omni-competence. It does not have competency in every area, especially in the areas of the economy. In the area of the economy, knowledge is diffuse. There are areas to leave to the free market entrepreneurs. It's currently a hindrance to economic growth. Well, absolutely. I've said this on a number of occasions. I'm old enough to remember, and it's very upsetting that I get to say I'm old enough to remember things now. Back in the 1990s, those earnest debates about what role should the state have, and it was often, put into the sterile dichotomy between, this, either some sort of Soviet behemoth or some sort of East Asian developmental state that is disciplining capital. I don't know if it takes a cane like they do in Singapore and, hits you on the bum, or, Milton Friedman, free markets. I think that we've got to a point where it's not ideological anymore. The state just does not have the capacity to do half the stuff. If some, and I've said, well, if you want extensive state, and if you want to, if you can persuade the Singaporeans or the South Koreans or the Swedes to lend us their civil service, we can move ahead on that basis. But at the moment, we have what we have. And until you can actually, push it into something capable of driving development, we're going to have to deal with the very constrained realities that we have at the moment. And I would say, get the foundations right, get the water flowing, the power, keep the power maintained, fix the potholes. We can then talk about small business desks and whatever other bells and whistles you want. So, I don't know if you have any final words.
No, just to thank our audience for attending, and otherwise potentially, not exactly the most thrilling topic, but the most fundamental to all our lives, irrespective of whether we're rich or poor. And thanks for having me, Terence. And
been fun. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending. And I'm sorry, I see there have been a couple of comments which we're out of time now, but do keep in touch. Message us. We'd be very happy to engage with you further. Please go to our website, irr.org.za, and download a copy of the report. Those of you who feel that it makes decent points, share it with your networks on social media, and please keep in touch with us. With that, once again, thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and thank you to all of you.